After Barry Goldwater's big defeat in 1964, conservatives were wandering around lost in the liberal wilderness. And then Paul Weyrich came to Washington. He transformed the lost conservatives into a movement that has become a mighty force. He really invented the conservative movement.
I want to be like Paul Weyrich when I grow up.
And Paul, you've impacted me. You've impacted me by the way you have been so tireless and fearless in your defense of the truth, the things that we care about, the things that we are willing to shed blood over, our own blood.
Now, many of our Christians have what I call the goo-goo syndrome. Good government. They want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote.
Stop the count! Stop the count! Stop the count! Stop the count!
What year were you born and in what city?
I was born in 1942 in Racine, Wisconsin.
When Paul Weyrich was born, Wisconsin had been dominated for decades by the Progressive Party, founded by the charismatic Senator Fighting Bob La Follette. La Follette brought together a coalition of farmers, workers, and labor unions against the corruption of big business and its partners in the Republican Party. La Follette was originally raised a Republican, but he was ostracized from the party after he refused to take a bribe. Despite its populism, the Progressive Party advocated for the Wisconsin idea, where all classes would work together in harmony under the supervision of a benevolent state run by university-educated experts like La Follette himself. When Fighting Bob died, his son, Young Bob, replaced him as senator and head of the Progressive Party. In the early 50s, Young Bob was defeated by the fierce anti-communist Joseph McCarthy. It was in this time of upheaval, when the progressive dream was coming to an end, that Weyrich grew up.
Can I be excused, Mom? I have a date. I gotta get going.
Yes,
Yeah,
Jack.
me too.
Okay.
Hi, Dad. Hi.
My father used to say, in America they say that you shouldn't talk religion and politics, but one determines your temporal life and the other determines your eternal life. What else is there to talk about? And so, indeed, that's what he talked about, politics and religion.
When did you begin to feel strongly about things like values and other things?
Well, he was a very religious man.
Dad, would you read the scriptures, please?
Gladly. Oh, Dottie, dear, will you please bring the Bible?
Sure, Gramp.
Went to church every day despite working 2 jobs.
What church?
Well, the Holy Name Roman Catholic Church. He even got the hospital to rearrange its schedule so that he could get to church every day. And, it was very evident in talking with him that he really believed what he was preaching.
Besides attending church every day, Weyrich's father was an avid listener to the charismatic radio priest Charles Coughlin, who was known for plagiarizing Nazi speeches, but replacing the word Jew with banker. Father Coughlin, like many Americans at the time, supported the fascist regimes of Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco.
Father was intensely interested in politics. That's all he talked about. I knew members of the cabinet when I was 5 years old.
Paul was groomed from birth for politics by his father and by a local Republican business magnate named Fritz Wrench, who financed his trips to Washington, D.C. As a teenager, he fervently supported the campaign of Senator Robert Taft Jr., a staunch opponent of NATO, as well as of American intervention in World War II. Taft had been one of the founding members of the Conservative Coalition, which united Southern Democrats and Midwestern Republicans against the New Deal and unions. Taft was also the author of the Labor Management Relations Act of 1947, which broke one of the largest strikes the nation ever saw.
Western Electric employees swell the growing total of striking workers throughout the country. Thousands of New York telegraph workers also walk out and picket Western Union buildings, crippling telegraphic communications. Less than 15% of messages are being handled in the New York area. Although the strike was conducted in an orderly manner, police occasionally have to use persuasion to pass an unaffected employee through the picket line.
The act outlawed most types of strikes, banned closed shops, and required all union officers to sign both a loyalty oath to the government and an affidavit swearing that they were not nor ever had been members of the Communist Party. The first campaign Weyrich ever organized himself was to save a railway which went from Milwaukee to Chicago, a railway incidentally built by the socialist mayor of Milwaukee, Frank Zeidler. Weyrich would be enamored by trains throughout his life. In 1960, Paul joined the Young Republicans while attending the University of Wisconsin, which was the very same university from which the progressive Wisconsin idea had emerged half a century earlier. In 1964, Weyrich worked on the presidential campaign of Barry Goldwater, the first conservative Republican to win the presidential nomination. Prior to this, the Republican Party had been dominated by liberal capitalists who emphasized the free market and social progress.
Next in order of nomination is Governor Nelson Rockefeller. This demonstration is more a show of loyalty than anything else, for Mr. Rockefeller had previously thrown his support to William Scranton. An historic move is cheered by the backers of Senator Hiram Fong of Hawaii, the first man of Asiatic blood ever to be placed in nomination for the President of the United States. Also tradition-shattering is Senator Margaret Chase Smith, the first woman whose name has ever been presented to the delegates of a major political party as candidate for the presidency.
Despite being a member of the NAACP and the Urban League, Barry Goldwater's opposition to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, on libertarian grounds that states and private businesses shouldn't be coerced by the federal government to desegregate, allowed him to form an alliance with Southern Democrats like Jesse Helms, Strom Thurmond, and Governor George Wallace, who tried to become his running mate.
We represent the majority of the people in Alabama who hate niggerism, Catholicism, Judaism, and all the isms of the whole world.
So said Robert Creel of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan. He also said, I like Barry Goldwater. He needs our help. Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd.
Choose the way of this present administration, and you make real the prospect of an America unarmed and aimless in the face of militant communism around the world. Instead, I ask that you join me in proving that every man, every American, can stand on his own, make up his own mind, chart his own future, keep and control his own family.
Now let us pray, children. Dear Heavenly Father, may your words guide us. Help us to live as your dedicated children.
And this man speaks for them. His name is Barry Goldwater. In your heart, you know he's right. Vote for Barry Goldwater.
Though he lost, Goldwater permanently shifted the Republican Party both to the right and the South.
When did you first come to Washington?
I came to Washington right after the 1966 elections. I had produced a documentary on 6 different candidates, a radio documentary that campaigned for office in Colorado, and Gordon Allott, who was then senior senator from Colorado, was one of them, and I campaigned with him. And after the election, he called up and said, I want to see you in my office. And I honestly thought that he was going to complain about the documentary. Instead, he offered me a job as his press secretary.
He went on to work for several Republican senators who he thought aligned with his religious upbringing.
It made an enormous impression on me, and I began to think that, well, these things are really important, and somebody ought to do something about it. I remember calling the Republican Party chairman, a fellow by the name of Claude Jasper, in Wisconsin, in 1962, when the ruling came down against prayer in the schools. And I said, you know, the party ought to come out really against that. And he said, oh, why would we want to mix up, you know, the party in that kind of an issue? And I said, well, because it's wrong. And we just argued back and forth, and, you know, he didn't end up doing a thing about it. And I thought that was a dreadful mistake.
We acknowledge thy divine help in the selection of our leadership each 4 years. We recognize, O Lord, that in thy sovereignty thou hast permitted Richard Nixon to lead us at this momentous hour of our history. We beseech thee that he will have thy divine guidance and power daily. Help him as thou didst help thy servants of old. Our Father, we know the...
Right after Richard Nixon was elected in 1968, I had the privilege of attending a strategy session run by the left. It was essentially run by the Civil Rights Coalition. And before me was laid out how they operated. I had seen the effect of this many times, but I didn't know the mechanics. And what I saw was a mixture of think tanks, of political action committees, of lobbies, of interest groups, and they all interacted with each other. Even journalists were there, and they all interacted with each other in order to bring about a particular desired result. Having seen this mechanics, if you will, I became maniacal in telling everybody that would listen to me, I know how the other side operates. We need to set up something similar.
The early 1970s were a particularly turbulent period of American politics. In 1970, a leaked document revealed that the U.S. was secretly bombing Cambodia, resulting in hundreds of thousands of deaths and the rise to power of the genocidal Khmer Rouge. This led to a massive student strike, and President Nixon ordered the military and National Guard to stop it. At one of the protests at Kent State in northeast Ohio, 4 students were killed by the National Guard, which escalated the protests into a national insurrection. Nixon had to be squirreled away at Camp David, while troops occupied Washington, D.C.
A federal grand jury in Detroit today charged the 13 top leaders of the Weathermen with plotting to bomb public buildings in Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Berkeley, California.
At 7:30 this morning, KPFK received a call from a woman identifying herself as a member of the Weather Underground.
Hello. I'm going to read a declaration of a state of war.
The struggle that is going to ultimately defeat United States imperialism is going to be an international struggle. It's going to be an armed struggle. It's going to be a struggle that's going to have to take place in the third world against U.S. imperialism and in the mother country against U.S. imperialism. We must be clear on how the final struggle will be waged, and we must be a part of that struggle. Students must be opening up the campuses to the working class, must be going into the working class communities, becoming part of the proletariat, and must be getting ready for armed struggle.
According to FBI statistics from the time, there were 2,500 domestic bombings in the span of just 18 months in the following years of 1971 and 1972. These bombings were mostly perpetrated by leftist guerrilla groups, such as the Weather Underground, the Black Liberation Army, and the Symbionese Liberation Army. In 1971, radical anti-war activists formed the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI, which burgled the FBI offices in D.C. and revealed that they had been spying on, harassing, and even assassinating civil rights activists through their counterintelligence program known as COINTELPRO.
The moral strength of our nation has decreased alarmingly. We must return to the teachings of God if we are to cure this sickness.
Only a few months after the revelations about the FBI's domestic spying programs, a corporate lawyer named Lewis Powell, who had spent his career defending Philip Morris and American Tobacco by lying on their behalf about the cancer-causing effects of cigarette smoking, was determined to restore the power of the business elites. Powell wrote a confidential memo to the Chamber of Commerce entitled Attack on the American Free Enterprise System.
Anyone who has an insurance policy, a bank deposit, or a share of stock is helping to finance our business system. A constant stream of savings dollars must flow into big and small business each year. These dollars help to buy the land, the buildings, the tools and equipment, and create new job opportunities for our expanding population. The goods we produce are distributed to main streets all over the country.
In the memorandum, Powell's intentions are very clear. He wanted to make sure that
the principles of our business system remain the same.
Powell was not worried about the communists, new leftists, and other revolutionaries, as they had been systematically crushed and turned against each other by the FBI. No, he wrote that
the most disquieting voices joining the chorus of criticism comes from perfectly respectable elements of society, from the college campus, the pulpit, the media, the intellectual and literary journals, the arts and sciences, and from politicians. In most parts of these groups, the movement against the system is participated in only by minorities, yet these often are the most articulate, the most vocal, the most prolific in their writing and speaking.
To combat this vocal and articulate minority, Powell proposed that businesses must work to take over the courts, the schools, the media, and the government.
If our system is to survive, top management must be equally concerned with protecting and preserving the system itself. This involves far more than an increased emphasis on public relations or governmental affairs. Two areas in which corporations long have invested substantial sums.
In 1972, Nixon was re-elected, and he appointed Lewis Powell to the Supreme Court.
The management of every business has a continuing problem to improve their product to stay ahead of competition, or else.
The Powell memo was passed around by America's most powerful entrepreneurs, eventually landing on the desk of a man named Joseph Coors, the head of the Coors Brewing Company.
Taste the high country. Taste the high country.
Coors is born high in the Rockies, and the quality never comes down. It's brewed with pure Rocky Mountain spring water and its own special high country barley.
It's not downstream beer.
There's no flatland beer.
It's not city beer.
It's Coors.
Taste the high country.
Coors, like Weyrich, hated labor unions and fought tooth and nail to prevent his brewery's workers from organizing. Coors, like Weyrich, knew the power of fundamentalist Christianity, as he saw it firsthand when his grandfather's business was brought to its knees by Prohibition. In 1929, the situation grew so dire that Joe's grandfather, Adolf Coors, allegedly committed suicide by throwing himself off a balcony at his suite at the Cavalier Hotel.
What was Joe Coors' first check? Do you remember that?
$250,000.
How long did that last you?
Well, that was for a year, and he contributed $250,000 for a long time.
$250,000 in 1971 would be worth roughly $1.6 million today. Coors would become one of the many wealthy financial backers of the Heritage Foundation, who mostly came from powerful oil dynasties like the Kochs, Scaifes, and Hunts. Besides the Coors family's reputation for union busting, Joseph also had ties to the Ku Klux Klan and were staunch opponents of Nixon's Environmental Protection Agency, since Coors Brewing was the largest dumper of hazardous waste in all of Colorado.
We were so dumb, we didn't even know about 501c3s. And so Coors did a joint venture. We formed a little corporation to produce research materials, and he did a joint venture between the Adolf Coors Company and ARA, and funded that. And then an attorney that we both know came along and said, "Well, you don't have to do that. Why don't you form a foundation?" And so we did.
Tax exempt, 501c3
tax exempt foundation.
I haven't seen the current figures. I know you no longer haven't been with them for years, but they're over $40 million operation and over 200 employees. And I mean, most people cite them as the preeminent conservative think tank in this town.
But Weyrich realized that to build his movement, he needed more than funding and elaborate tax evasion schemes. He would need to create or co-opt a grassroots campaign that could get people in the streets. He would find such a people in Kanawha County, West Virginia.
Coal. Over 400 million tons of bituminous coal is taken out of the ground every year in this country. Coal to make steel, to power generators, coal for 100 byproducts. In many sections of the United States, coal is king. Yet today, coal is a king on a tottering throne.
For most of its history, the entire government of West Virginia was controlled by coal companies who ran company towns where you could only use company money called scrip. The companies, run by people who rarely set foot in the state, tore up the land and sent generations of men and children to their deaths in black lung and cave-ins. Having to endure all this, the Appalachian inhabitants of West Virginia became a tough and rebellious people. Strikes were constant, and repression was harsh and swift.
Hurry, Tom. No, I'll have supper. Beans and potatoes. Tea, Tom, go tell Daddy come and eat.
By the 1970s, the coal companies had outsourced their mining to countries with cheaper labor, and many fled the state looking for work elsewhere. The union bosses, who had once been the only defenders of the miners against the coal companies, all struck deals with management. At the same time, the federal government was defunding and integrating schools all across the country. More than 50 schools closed in Kanawha County alone in 1973. Soon, the predominantly white rural Appalachians had to go to the same schools as the more diverse inhabitants of the capital, Charleston.
It was supposed to be routine. In the spring of 1974, school board members for Kanawha County, West Virginia, met to consider new textbooks for the 1974-75 school year.
Integrating schools also meant reforming the textbooks, which previously featured all-white canon and only white history. In 1974, the National Education Association introduced new textbooks for the local school board to approve. The proposed language arts book featured a diverse and surprisingly radical range of authors, such as the Beat poet Allen Ginsberg, Black Panther Eldridge Cleaver, and Sigmund Freud, the father of modern psychiatry. Other books included Animal Farm by George Orwell, The Crucible by Arthur Miller, Letters from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King Jr., and the autobiography of Malcolm X.
At the risk of losing a chunk of funding, the board approved the books.
Most of the school board approved, but one woman objected. Her name was Alice Moore, and she was the wife of a fundamentalist minister who had just moved to Kanawha County from down south to evangelize. She had been elected to the school board on a platform of stopping sex education. Alice Moore's campaign was funded and endorsed by the Movement to Restore Decency, an arm of the John Birch Society. Even today, Kanawha County has no sex education program. Alice demanded that every single textbook be sent to her so she could review them.
I would propose a solution to the problem would be to remove these books for the remainder of the school year and to go back to the old textbooks that we used last year and allow time for a review and for an establishment of guidelines in which to judge these books.
As soon as you get the vote, which I rather surmise what it's going to be, would you let me finish my motion?
Complete my motion.
And you will find
Don't quote me unless you complete it.
You will find the motion.
You'll have your chance to revise.
She then revised this not to purchase until she had read the books. In my opinion, it's a grave error on her part.
She claimed to find references to gay sex from Ginsberg and a quote that Christians were brainwashed from the autobiography of Malcolm X.
Somebody asked us while we were coming up the road, wonder what the Board of Education thinks about this demonstration. The Board of Education don't care how long you march, as long as you go back to school. That's right. Now the thing we have to do is to stay out of school until the books are gone. We must stay out of school. Everybody that's marched in this parade today, if you don't stay out of school, your march was in vain. We must close the schools. As for me and my house, I don't go back to work. Neither do my children go to school until these books are taken out. The books must go.
Only a few students were kept home at first, but then the coal miners joined in. Many of the miners were parents, and many were aching to strike anyway due to declining pay and massive layoffs. The union bosses denounced the anti-textbook protesters, but the miners went on strike anyway. Soon, the shouts of the parents and the booming voices of the snake-handling preachers were loud enough to attract the media circus. And following the media were the outsiders and the political profiteers. The first outsiders to come to Kanawha were, of course, the Ku Klux Klan, who came to support the fundamentalist ministers in their war against the dirty books.
the undersigned citizens and taxpayers of Kanawha County in the state of West Virginia hereby petition the Board of Education to deny the use of certain textbooks in the schools of this county. More specifically, it is requested that any textbooks, periodicals, pamphlets, or other instructional materials be prohibited which demean, encourage skepticism, or foster disbelief in the institutions of the United States of America and in Western civilization.
Then the NAACP, the National Textbook Association, and Episcopal United Council of Churches intervened on the side of the pro-textbook forces. Many students staged school walkouts in support of the textbooks as well, and the members of the school board remained steadfast. In response, the Reverend Charles Quigley asked an anti-textbook rally to pray that God will kill the giants who have mocked and made fun of dumb fundamentalists.
I declare it over. Let's sing hallelujah. How about it? Hallelujah. Hallelujah.
This kind of rhetoric led to the shooting of an innocent bystander during the height of the textbook war, and a student pointed out, they're shooting people because they don't want to see violence in books. Dr. Ken M. Young, the superintendent who was maced and chased out of town by the anti-textbook protesters, described the situation at the apex of the controversy in October 1974. School buses are riddled with sniper bullets, gas lines are cut, windshields broken, and bomb threats disrupt schools daily. Students, parents, custodians, secretaries, bus drivers, teachers, administrators, board members, judges, and law enforcement officers continue to receive personal threats of all kinds. Teachers and custodians must remove nails and broken glass from the school parking lots each morning, and several school buildings have been damaged by early morning firebombs and dynamite. One minister has prayed publicly for the death of 3 school board members. Workers have been shot and their cars destroyed when crossing picket lines. Coal mines, city transportation, major industrial plants, and businesses have been shut down for varying periods of time. Court injunctions have been issued, violators jailed, fined, and released, then jailed, fined, and released again. The state treasurer has estimated a revenue loss to date of $50 million.
Mrs. Lavender, you're still upset even though this temporary taking of the books out of the schools has been noted.
Yes, sir.
What is your main objection to the books?
Well, I don't like some of the things that are in the books because, for one reason, I have read some of them, and I have a daughter. She's a sophomore in East Bank High School, and I know that she is old enough to know right from wrong, but I have 3 other children that are married, and they are planning on having a family, and I don't want my grandchildren to know of this stuff.
Talking about how society made him what he is and how he loves his fellow man, and no matter how much his fellow man hates him, he's going to continue to love them. Charles Manson is the one with his with his gang of women who went in and slaughtered people in Hollywood, made all the national press, all the news, all of our children know it. And we are defending, or we let this man defend himself in a textbook. I don't see anything on the other side of the issue. I looked through the book and I didn't see anything to suggest that Mr. Manson, what's his name, might be wrong. Now don't tell me that these books don't tell them to go out and join the revolution. I've read too much of it. They tell them to destroy the Constitution.
However, there were no references to Charles Manson in the textbooks, nor was there any of Ginsburg's work mentioning gay sex. But when the concerned parents finally got the textbooks, they thought the school board was hiding the real books from them. Alice Moore took her grievances straight to the PTA, the local news, and churches across the county. She charged that the books were filthy, disgusting, unpatriotic, and unduly favoring blacks. a sea of angry parents and preachers filled the cramped school board meetings, a line was drawn in the sand. In one side were the rural Christian Creekers, who worked in the old mine towns, and on the other were the urban liberal Charlestonians. One side was Appalachian and Pentecostal, the other was Metropolitan and Episcopal. An article from the Village Voice in 1974 would declare the textbook controversy a holy war between people who depend on books and people who depend on the book. Indeed, some of the few who remembered the Kanawha County textbook controversy would call it the Great Textbook War.
Here's the rest of the agreement. Here's just the way it's laid out. All men will be reinstated without reprisal. Amen. And, of course, the books will be pulled out. This is what's going to bring us about. And all injunctions, and I'm going to shout for myself on this one. I got about 35 of them. And all the injunctions will be dropped.
When the textbook war moved from the streets to the courts, the Ku Klux Klan offered to defend the Reverend Marvin Horan, but he refused. Instead, he turned to Paul Weyrich and his newly established Heritage Foundation for his legal defense.
Reverend Grayley, what do you think about the judge saying that he couldn't believe you in his courtroom?
I hope that the judge will understand that I was very tired, and if people was watching up at the Board of Education at times, my mind would be blank, and I'd have to lay my head over on the truck.
In the end, the textbooks were reinstated, but they could only be taken out with a permission slip from the parents. Reverend Horan only got 3 years in prison for inciting the bombing campaign, which lasted from 1974 to 1975. Despite this, the war continued to rage for months, and the churches even set up their own schools during the boycott.
We're using some of the textbooks that's used in the public schools, the basic textbooks, history books, algebra books, math books. Some of our reading books are a little different. We have some books that are written by Christian publications out of Pensacola, Florida. We'll also be using the open court reading program, which is also approved and on the state approved list.
There is one other book I assume you'll have.
Yes, sir. We'll definitely have the Bible. The Bible will be the main textbook. Each child will have to have a Bible, King James Version of the Bible, to carry with them to class.
Despite the end of the textbook war, the network of Christian schools remained and grew in Kanawha County and across the state. But farther south, Christian schools were established for slightly different reasons. As integration was mandated by the courts, many white parents began taking their children out of public schools and enrolling them in private segregation academies. In 1969, black parents in Mississippi sued the Treasury Department to prevent the newly opened all-white private schools from receiving tax-exempt status, arguing that such discriminatory institutions could not be considered charities. The court ruled to take away the charity status of the academies, but this was met by fierce resistance, and many of the schools remain open to this day, with a very low minority population or none at all. A 1972 report by a coalition of civil rights groups found that the vast majority of these new white private schools used the words Christian or church in their names.
These folks, they had operated essentially in a ghetto. Yeah, we know that abortion is legal, but we're teaching our kids not to have them. And so you couldn't get them active on that basis. But as soon as Carter moved against the Christian schools, they suddenly realized they couldn't remain in their ghetto any longer.
Throughout the 70s, support for racial segregation waned, and Weyrich found that he could not use that issue to mobilize conservative Christians. So Paul once again turned to various corporate sponsors and Republican politicians to create the Conservative Caucus of State Legislators in 1973. However, the name was quickly changed as the word conservative was deemed too unpopular at the time. So, the group was renamed the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, to sound more neutral. The ALEC functioned as a sort of trade show, where corporations would sell favorable policies to politicians in exchange for financial support. In 1975, the ALEC would be recognized as a tax-exempt charity. He also founded the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress, another tax-exempt charity, in 1974, in order to counter the influence of labor unions in government.
The committee is a bipartisan political committee aimed at electing conservatives to the House and Senate. And so in that arena, we, of course, are interested in getting people who are potential voters to be registered and to vote. And so we have been counseling with some of the pastors.
We have a threefold primary responsibility. Number one, get people saved. Number two, get them baptized. Number three, get them registered to vote.
Jerry Falwell had been a prominent member of the old Protestant Christian right, which emphasized opposition to communism and support of segregation. He was among many influential Southern preachers that established all-white Christian schools. Another of these preachers was Bob Jones, who was a staunch anti-Catholic that claimed race mixing was outlawed by the Bible. When the IRS sought to revoke Bob Jones University's tax exemption status, the Heritage Foundation and Jerry Falwell came to their defense. Weyrich and Falwell sought to shift the conversation from racial discrimination to religious freedom.
This program today is not political. It's totally based upon the importance, the sanctity of religious freedom in the United States of America. And published now this booklet entitled Declassified Material. Declassified Material. It's a briefing on why we oppose an immediate nuclear freeze. I'd like for you to have this booklet.
I had long advocated the outreach to the evangelical community. I come from a half Catholic, half Protestant family. And as a result, I understood the similarities between the two. Many people looked for the differences at the time, but I saw the similarities, and it made no sense to me that people who had the same values were voting in opposite directions. And I began to think of what could you do?
It is not a Baptist issue. Abortion is not a Roman Catholic issue. It is a moral issue. It is a theological issue. It is a human rights issue, an issue that concerns the human rights of unborn babies who, by the hundreds of thousands, are being murdered.
In the latter 1970s, a decision was made to target a prominent, skilled religious communicator to see if he would start moving people into political participation.
That is when we began talking to various persons about forming some kind of entity. I convened a meeting here in Lynchburg back in those days. I'm going to guess it was 1979, probably early 79, in which I invited many of my friends in Washington with whom I'd been talking about this thing.
So that they see that what they're battling is the same thing, and they need to be unified. Falwell stopped me and he said, go back to what you said earlier. Well, I misinterpreted him and I started to say something. No, he said, you started out by saying out there is something. What did you call that? And I had to think of what I said. And finally I said, I said there was a moral majority. And he said, that's it. He turned to his guy and he said,
that's what I'm going to call the organization, moral majority.
Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down.
If you think our solution is political, you too have been deceived.
Don't you commit yourself to some political party or politician. You commit yourself to the principles of God and demand those parties and politicians align themselves with the eternal values in this book, and America will be forever the greatest nation on this earth.
Thank you, Dr. Criswell. Thank all of you. Thank you very much. Thank you. And please.
As the 1980 elections came around, the newly formed moral majority threw its support behind the anti-communist firebrand, Ronald Reagan, who promised to protect the independent Christian schools from federal coercion. When Reagan won, it was clear that the new Christian right was a force to be reckoned with.